As the last of US troops withdraw, Afghanistan's rapid descent into chaos and violence has begun. 6 provincial capitals have already been seized. This puts at risk the huge investments India has made towards rebuilding that nation over the last 2 decades. It raises fears about regional stability and the escalation of cross-border terrorism into India. Should India accept the ground reality of Taliban's imminent takeover and join the other regional powers, including Russia, Iran, and China, in engaging with it? Or should India stay away and stay firm in its commitment to democracy and offer greater support to the civilian government of Afghanistan in its hour of need? India is at an important crossroads. The choice that India makes will have great long-term ramifications, not only for Afghanistan, but for India's self-identity. I'm honored to have a panel of some of the top national experts with varied viewpoints to examine the situation from multiple dimensions. We have with us today General Kamaljeet Singh, who's a Lieutenant General, former Army Commander, Advisor to Chief Minister of Haryana and Information Commissioner, as well as Consultant on Strategy Affairs and Public Policy. We have Dr. T.C.A. Raghavan, who has served as India's High Commissioner to Pakistan. He's the Director General of Indian Council of World Affairs, an influential think tank, and he represented India in 2018 Moscow talks with Taliban. We have Dr. Swaran Singh, who is a professor of diplomacy and disarmament at the School of International Studies, JNU, Delhi. We have Abhijit Iyer Mitra, who's a senior fellow at the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies and a member of Observer Research Foundation. We have Kabir Taneja, who's a fellow with Strategic Studies program at ORF and is a foreign policy expert and author. Welcome all of you to Argumentative Indians, a platform for honest debates. If I may request you, Dr. Raghavan, to briefly explain to us what is at stake in Afghanistan for India. Why is the situation in Afghanistan so important for India?
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. Before I respond to your question, I would like to clarify that I'm no longer Director General of the Indian Council of World Affairs because my tenure there ended about 3 weeks ago. So I just wanted to clarify that. On your question of what is at stake for India and Afghanistan, one could argue that perhaps there is not so much at stake, and this is being amplified out of proportion in the media because as political realities stand today, we are not directly adjunct to Afghanistan in the way we used to be till 1947. In other words, we are not a direct physical neighbor. And to that extent, whatever takes place in Afghanistan, we are one step removed from it. It is not as if there's going to be a massive refugee influx into India because of the situation deteriorating in Afghanistan. There may be some number of refugees coming in, but not in large numbers. The primary impact of refugee movements will be felt on Afghanistan's direct physical neighbors. So in that sense, we are one step removed. But if we reflect on the question, you realize that in fact, the implications for what happens in Afghanistan are much more profound than the first set of answers would suggest. Why do I say that? Principally because whatever happens in Afghanistan has a great impact on India. This is true historically, of course, but even if one looks at recent developments in terms of what has happened in South Asia in the past 4 or 5 decades, you realize that the major decline in security and the strategic instability which crept into South Asia really began with what happened in Afghanistan in 1979. The Soviet Union invaded in 1979, a civil war began over there. The Soviets withdrew in 1989, and thereafter you find immediately after that, the beginnings of an insurgency in Jammu and Kashmir from 1989, 1990 onwards. And this really is an example of how the security situation in Afghanistan impacts on us directly. The fact is, even if we are not physically next to it, it is very much part of our region. And therefore, anything happening in Afghanistan has an impact on us in numerous ways. So that is how I would answer your question in very brief terms, that we cannot ignore what is happening in Afghanistan because it is a vital part of the ecosystem we are situated in.
Thank you. So basically, decline in security in South Asia is a direct result of instability in Afghanistan. Now, Taliban is making rapid progress in taking back city after city in Afghanistan. Everybody in the region seems to be prepared for the worst case scenario where Taliban completely takes over and Kabul is back in their hands. What would it mean for India? Abhijit, can I ask you to sort of share with us the vision of the world when if Taliban were to take over Afghanistan?
And can you hear me? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, we can.
So the first thing is we need to understand that this time when the Taliban, if they take over, is not the Taliban. It is a sort of, and this I saw on the ground, because what Pakistan had effectively done was it had siloized all the local leaderships. When I spoke to the Taliban commander in Ghor, for example, he really didn't know and didn't care what was happening in valleys and areas around him. Same in Ghazni, right? Same in Helmand and places like that. So you consistently had what seemed to be a Pakistani policy of essentially divide and rule, keep them siloized, and that way you can control them much better. In the same way that they keep, Kashmiri terrorist groups siloized and therefore easier to control. And then when you go out of control, it's much easier to deal with you because, the Indian state only uses carrots. The Pakistanis don't hesitate to use both carrots and sticks. So what happens out here is, what you're going to have is effectively a Pakistani takeover.
Abhijit, can I make a small interruption? Yeah. Your voice is a bit feeble. Is it possible for you to...
Is this better?
Much better. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So that this is going to be a Pakistani takeover. Very curiously, if you watch this video I've tweeted out, for the first time we've seen Taliban troops actually wearing combat fatigues, kurta in the fatigue style, the typical Afghan kurta pajama in the fatigue style and things like that. There is a lot of evidence to show that they are in fact getting armed, of course. What I still don't get is the military angle, because technically speaking, the without heavy artillery or heavy equipment and air cover, they shouldn't be able to overrun so much. And the Afghan Air Force kind of has a monopoly on air power out there. And unlike, say, the Battle of Jalalabad, in the early 90s, where the Pakistani army actually intervened, you're not seeing a Pakistani Air Force intervention out here. So in spite of this sort of air superiority, you're seeing a lot of advances which seem quite inexplicable to me. Number one. Number two, what is the shape that this new government is going to take if it takes over in that sense? You need to separate two different things out here. There's been, the shooting of the woman in the jeans who was traveling out without a male chaperone, and people interpret this as being ISIS rule again in that sense. We have to separate the normal brutality of life in Afghanistan and attitude to women in general to what the Taliban does. Remember that lady in Kabul who was accused of blasphemy, slightly mad lady apparently who was accused of blasphemy, stoned to death in front of everybody, TV cameras, everything. Afghan National Police around did nothing, and ultimately killed by the riverside near the Turkish mosque. So, there's different, we shouldn't conflate war crimes and the general human rights abuses that happen out there with what the Taliban will do. Now, the problem with a siloized government that you will see under the Taliban, because the commanders are siloized, is you're going to probably see a situation like the Mujahideen after the collapse of the Najibullah government, which is that you're going to probably see quite a bit of infighting, and it won't suit the Pakistanis. The real key to see what the new Taliban government will be like is how the Pakistanis manage this. If they are able to reconcile these factions and force them to work together, because they've grown extremely powerful in their own right, or if they will be, made into a unified thing like the Taliban, like Taliban 1, in which case it becomes something of an unmanageable commodity for the Pakistanis. So let's see. I'm cautiously optimistic that it will be like the period of chaos in between, which I think suits us better anyway.
Thank you. So since 2001, India has invested immense time and effort towards Afghanistan reconstruction process. India has built roads, dams, electricity lines, schools, and hospitals. According to Indian Foreign Minister Jaishankar, India's 400 plus projects are spread over all 34 provinces of Afghanistan, and the total aid amounts to up to $3 billion US. So in terms of the investment being at risk and the sort of scary scenario Abhijit has highlighted, where one possibility is a Taliban takeover becomes a Pakistan takeover of this vast region. Why do we have this firm policy of no boots on the ground? Couldn't Indian Air Force, if not reverse, at least stall the progress of Taliban? I want to get General Singh's view on this one.
Firstly, thank you for having me on the panel. It's a very wonderful opportunity to share our views, and I'm also very thrilled to see my co-panelists who are experts. So I hope to learn from them rather than what little I can share with them. First thing is, for me, it is a little bit of, what should I say, very disturbing to that extent that I had trained in National Defense Academy with Afghan cadets. In my army career, I have trained Afghans multiple times. And during the Indian Military Academy's passing out parade, I was a reviewing officer with Afghan Chief of Army Staff, General Afsar Karimi. Both of us were reviewing that parade. As a great gesture to honor him, I was at the last minute told to step aside and be the co-panel officer, reviewing officer, which rarely happens, but in the interest of honoring them, I was more than thrilled to do that. So I was enthused to interact with those officers who are going to be part of Afghan National Security Forces. And we all read about Afghanistan. I did my dissertation projects in higher command and NDC on Afghanistan. So I asked them this question intentionally, that you all belong to which tribes? And I got a resounding slap kind of a reply that we are Afghans and we do not belong to any tribes. So I was thrilled to see that. And when I asked General Afsar Karimi that will you be training with Pakistanis? They said never. How can we train with Pakistanis? They might be our immediate enemies. So somewhere you feel very hurt that Americans have not allowed us to, in my perception, do beyond a point, because we have left the Afghan National Security Forces without two major force multipliers, artillery and tanks. They have some kind of semblance of air force. We also gave them gunships, Mi-35s, Mi-24s, converted to Mi-35s. We gave them 8 of them, and we trained their pilots also. But I wish we had done enough. Because of Pakistan's insistence, this particular force has been left with very limited, circumscribed kind of capabilities. It has been given the shape of a counterinsurgency force and not a conventional force. So like Abhijit was flagging this issue, that Americans had promised over the horizon support. They have given it in some cities like Kandahar, but they haven't given it in all cities. In Lashkar Gah also they gave. So the one perception which is coming in media is that Americans don't have a base. Last time when they operated, they took hold of Shamshi base, which is in Pakistan, which was actually with UAE and in turn given to Americans. And Shamshi was incidentally for hunting the bustard, which sheikhs are very fond of. So that came in handy for Americans. This time, Shamshi is not possible because it is in Balochistan, very close to where China is setting up all these facilities. Gwadar is close. And now there is so much of angst in Pakistan also. They don't want to give it to Americans. So Americans are operating from Gulf. And since they are operating from Bahrain and ships, they are at the fag end of their endurance when they come over Afghanistan. And probably they are not able to cover the northern provinces. That's why places like Kunduz and other have fallen, which are Taklan and all these have gone. Pul Khumri, Sher Pul or Pul Sher, these things have fallen because they are in the northwest, and probably the drones, when by the time they come there, they don't have sufficient intelligence for these operations, because somebody has to vector these drones to deliver the munitions over there. Other thing which is being talked about is, we have no clear-cut answers, is being talked about is that is there some kind of a conspiracy on part of Iranians and others to allow them to take control of their border posts? Because you can understand that they take over Chaman Post or Spin Boldak towards Pakistan. But how have they managed to take over the border crossings on Iran border? And why have they taken over parts of Herat province, where Shias reside? So there are questions still. Hazaras and Shias and their provinces are not getting enough support from Iran. So which side is Iran supporting? Has it had a tacit understanding with Taliban's? And please don't rule out that in Afghan method of war fighting, chivalry is not a big issue. There's lots to do with bakshish, bribery, yes. Turning, camps. So some commanders can be bought over. So Taliban is using social media, all these kind of influences. But I would still say that Taliban's strategy currently is to take hold of outlying provinces, not put pressure on capitals as yet, but it will slowly squeeze in the thing. But when its control over Afghanistan will become meaningful, when it is in control of cities like Kandahar, Herat, Mazar-e-Sharif, Jalalabad, and Kabul. Because today, surprisingly, 25% of Afghanis live in Kabul and neighboring areas. Everybody is left outlying areas, and Afghanistan has become 75% hemmed into these cities, which I have named. So real control of Afghanistan will come from there. But I am willing to bet one thing on this, that Pakistan will not be able to control these Taliban people because they have become far too smart. Taliban 1.0, which was in 96 till about 2001, was basically followers. They were people who had not been bedded into politics and diplomacy and all this. And there used to be a joke that instead of being Taliban, they are being Shagirdgan. They are Shagirdgan of Pakistani ISI, and they are following they are being puppets. But Taliban 2.0 is a much smarter force, much more sort of honed into politics and diplomacy. So my feeling is that initially Pakistan may feel very happy, but it will have to pay for it. And China will also have to pay for it. Putting boots on ground is not recommended for India in my perception. Can we give them air support? Well, it is difficult. There is some thought that why doesn't UN get into this act and instead of putting boots on ground gives the over the horizon support? through certain countries which are capable of doing it. So these are the thoughts that I want to leave. And last thought I want to leave is that till Kabul airport is in hand of Turkish troops, there is some hope, diplomats and others surviving and retaining some sanity over Taliban. But if Kabul airport passes control to Taliban's or some other warlords, then it is the beginning of the end. That will be one signal that will be for us to see loud and clear. So with these opening remarks, I think let's hear other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. So one of the main reasons given for not involving India to a greater extent in future talks about Afghanistan is that India does not engage with Taliban, and India-Taliban relationships are almost non-existent, at least official relationships. And this is the direct result of India's consistent position that it does not want to engage with Taliban in any official capacity unless such talks are Afghan-led, Afghan-owned, and Afghan-controlled with the participation of the government of Afghanistan. And so this firm stance, this principal stance has, it seems that it has costed India in terms of its influence in the overall discussions on the matter. So I want to ask Professor Swaran Singh, what is the reason behind India's principal stand? When and how did India elevate itself to such a high moral ground in a geopolitical matter?
You see, India has been for almost 4 decades a direct victim of terrorism. And therefore, a very, very detailed discourse on how to deal with terrorists has evolved over a period of time, which has enormous domestic constituencies now backing that discourse. And it's not very easy to suddenly, make changes, even if you notice India is doing as quick learning as possible. And there is a certain amount of back channel discussion we know is now happening with Taliban, which I would like to say it's not if, but it is when and how Taliban comes to power for a second time in Afghanistan. And that kind of is a foregone conclusion in that sense. And that is why I think not just India, but several other stakeholders, regional players are fast forwarding their change in terms of engaging Taliban. Other than Pakistan, China would be another good example. You notice that last month, Wang Yi hosted in Tianjin, next to Beijing city, a delegation led by Deputy Amir, Mullah brother of the Taliban. And in that sense, China is majorly engaging both Ghani government and Taliban in another multilateral format of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So India, it seems like many other stakeholders had not assessed such a quick upsticking of NATO and US forces from the ground as it happened really. So some of these assessments are being sort of recalibrated. We can notice now Ghani government is also trying to sort of come up with some kind of engagement with warlords on the ground. For example, the Afghan National Defense and Security Force is engaging Taliban using various warlords that they were kind of at some time trying to really contain and rein on. Likewise, you can notice also Russia, which also has over a period of time engaged both the Taliban and Ghani government, but has now made Lavrov said it very clearly last month, standing next to Indian Ambassador Jaishankar, Indian Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar, that Russia is not willing to take any measures, meaning they are not going to send any troops on the ground. So I think, yes, there is a certain amount of principled stand of not making the distinction of good and bad terrorists, which goes back to India's engagement with Pakistan and experience of India's sort of domestic instability because of Pakistan using terrorism as tool of foreign policy. But also in that sense, gradual and quick learning, you notice everybody around the world now, even European allies of United States are openly blaming it on President Trump. To some extent also on President Joe Biden, saying that the Doha deal was something that legitimized Taliban. And Russia again is reluctant. Pakistan is sort of discredited, as Abhijit was just saying, to a great extent. that makes China a major player in that sense. So I would say China would empower Pakistan in taking over control together with China of the post-Taliban situation in Afghanistan. I understand that it's not that there is a direct existential threat to India from that. Indian investments also more or less may not be under direct threat in that sense, but it depends on what are India's national interests, what are India's objectives that India is trying to achieve. You notice that India is trying to project itself as a net security provider in the region, an emerging global player. You saw Prime Minister addressing UN Security Council, opening a very interesting new field of maritime security where India wants to take initiative. India also is chair of the Committee of UN Security Council on sanctions on Taliban. So India in that sense both has its own expectations and others have certain anticipations from India, which perhaps is the first thing that would make India really concerned about how Taliban takes over. And we notice that the semantics have clearly changed. We are now not talking of good and bad terrorists. We are talking of questions of legitimacy as to whosoever comes to power. We are underlining concerns for immediate control and restraint on violence on the ground. So our semantics are clearly changing very, very quickly in that sense, how we wish to engage with Taliban to protect our interests in that sense. But in that context, you notice India has over a period of time also showcased its engagement with China, with Iran, with Russia, with Tajikistan, Central Asia. So you noticed Indian Foreign Minister was in Tehran when Taliban delegation was visiting them. He was also in Moscow when Taliban delegation was visiting Moscow. And the last point I think is interesting to compare Taliban 96 to 2001 and how has Taliban also learned from its mistakes last time. For instance, you hear Taliban repeatedly reassuring neighboring countries like Russia, China, Iran, Tajikistan, and India. Look at the fact that despite Pakistan nudging them to do something or say something on India's revocation of 370, when push came to shove, the spokesperson of Taliban clearly said it's an internal matter of India. Likewise, they are also reassuring China, for example, that they will not be at all involved in helping promoting ETIM, Eastern Turkmenistan movement, which is going on, and that is the main concern of China. They've assured Russia likewise. So they want to, first of all, make sure that the immediate neighbors are reassured that the coming of Taliban back in power is not going to lead to either the Islamic State finding a sanctuary there or some kind of Al-Qaeda coming back and playing a role. So they're trying to reassure everybody around the world that this is going to be a very different Taliban. And that leaves a very clear message to our concerns about what could happen in India's Kashmir. I think Taliban would try to show restraint in that sense and not kind of promote any Pakistan-driven activity in that region. Second, very significant is the element of how they are operating on the ground. They have gradually, constantly expanded their control of rural areas surrounding cities, which is a very typical asymmetric way of dealing with a conventional status quo power when you want to win over. And they are gradually circling these major cities and towns and gradually beginning to take over even these major cities. So what is happening here is that other than reassuring neighbors and the rest of the world that coming of Taliban to power is not going to be directly animus to any of these major powers in the neighboring countries, they also want to give a face saving to Ghani government. They are presenting Ghani government with a fait accompli very clearly, but giving Ghani government time to really accept those terms that Taliban would like to put on the table and make it appear as if it is a peaceful transfer of power. So you notice that intra-government dialogue also, intra-Afghan dialogue also, that facade is continuing. So it's an exercise domestically to play slow, incrementally, and gradually take over the main city, which also in terms of force equations, it would make sense that they don't want to really take over main headquarters of Afghanistan Defense and Security Forces, want to give them certain space to sort of find their way out to either sort of find some kind of a deal with Taliban or find some asylums. You saw about 1,000 soldiers, as we know, have moved over to Tajikistan already. So some warlords on the ground will, as always happened in 1996 onwards also, they will switch sides. I mean, they have done it all the time in Afghanistan. Some of them are already doing it on the ground. You notice one after another, leaders in various cities are beginning to say that they are engaging Taliban in a dialogue to make sure there's not much destruction as they take over these cities. So what I'm saying, both at the international level, the way Taliban is engaging, and very imperceptibly, gradually, how they are moving inside Afghanistan, they want to make sure that their coming to power is not seen as something which is not acceptable to constituencies at home and also countries around the world who are going to be major powers. And I assume that among major powers, United States has already burnt its fingers, is trying airstrikes, which are counterproductive very clearly on the ground. And in that sense, China is very likely to emerge as a major player. They will not send soldiers on the ground, of course, but they are going to offer both direct and indirect incentives. And I'm sure all of you understand how these direct and indirect incentives work. And just like you have seen in many other countries in the neighborhood, Afghanistan's Taliban might get certain offers made under the nomenclature of a Belt and Road Initiative. Already an expressway is on the offer between Kabul and Peshawar in that sense. So China is going to be a major player and it will co-opt Pakistan, is why I'm saying the coming of Taliban is a major game changer as far as India is concerned. What can India do? You asked a question whether we should have air coverage or air strikes or feet on the ground. I don't think India is ever meant to be a country that can afford to do that. United States has wanted India to send soldiers on the ground right from Persian Gulf War I, 1991. What India is very comfortable doing is to make sure that it can rescue its citizens. It has demonstrated that enormous capacity right from the Gulf War I to several other crises around the Middle East region. As we speak now, I think a special flight of Air India is already taking off from Mazar-e-Sharif with the first rescue operation. The first rescue operation is already on. And I think as General K.J. Singh just said, that in case they take over Kabul airport, then these rescue missions would also come under enormous stress. And we do not want to see what happened in South Vietnam when the American embassy rooftop pictures were going around the world. So rescue is what India may focus right now and not really, ratcheting up its military participation, military involvement in that region, because the Ghani government is on its way out as far as my assessment is concerned. India has supported Ghani government in various ways, equipment, etc., and other moral and economic support. But here is time when India has to really do as quick switching over in terms of engaging with Taliban as possible. Indian ambassador in Kabul, I'm sure, is likely to be the point person to begin to have a first dialogue or first connection as to how to make sure that Indian citizens, people who have Indian passports, Indian diplomatic corps, etc., is safe and secure. And for that, engagement with Taliban will be an essential prerequisite. And I think that should be the focus here, to make sure that as the transition takes place, India is engaged with the powers that are going to take over Kabul very soon.
Thank you, Professor Singh. So focusing on this point only, that India isn't really in a position to do much more than just rescue its own citizens there. And it seems to be like a foregone conclusion that China is going to be the major player. So have we as a nation accepted that we are now relinquishing our claim to South Asian leadership to China? Is that something that we are ready for? I'll get Kabir on this one.
All right, thanks. I think, look, first and foremost, let me just take a step back and start from Afghanistan itself. There are lots of good points mentioned throughout this panel till now. And when you're talking about whether are we talking to the Taliban or not, we have to remember that what does that entail and what does that mean, right? So, for example, the world has been talking to the Taliban through the Doha process. It's not just the Americans, right? We see the Taliban delegation in Doha jetting around across the world, going to China, going to Russia, Central Asia, and so on and so forth. I remember seeing them in Oslo, Norway, also, I think in 2015-16. So they've been at it for a while, right? And but there is a difference between what they offer or what you talk with them in Doha process and what actually can happen or does happen on the ground in Afghanistan. And we've seen that sort of play out much more recently. For example, when the Taliban spokesperson, Sohail Shaheen, told the Associated Press that, yeah, there have been instances where the leadership, where the Taliban commanders on the ground in Afghanistan have actually not listened to the leadership. Even today, earlier in the day, we saw an audio recording released by Mullah Yaqub, who's the deputy to the Taliban chief Akhundzada, and in which, in the audio recording, Mullah Yaqub has said that, sort of addressing the Taliban cadre on the ground, that you have to listen to us. You cannot plunder cities. You cannot go into people's homes and take their property and destroy their property and so on and so forth. So there are gaps, right? As Abhijit also mentioned earlier, there are silos at play here, and the homogeneity of the Taliban movement itself has a lot of cracks in it, which are going to play out as we move forward. I mean, even to see from the perspective of the Doha process, how many times have Mullah Baradar and co actually been to Afghanistan? They've been to the Raveri Shura in Quetta and so on and so forth. They've met Islamabad many times. They met Rawalpindi many times. But you've never seen them in Kabul or Kandahar or in Mazar-e-Sharif. So there is a sort of gap between when we are talking to the Taliban, or anybody is talking to the Taliban, even negotiating with the Taliban in Doha process, and what happens on the ground. There are going to be significant disparities at play, which we have seen now taking place, and which we will see increasingly taking place as we move forward. The Russians, maybe the Russians were actually correct when one of the deputies to Kabulov said that by September and October, you could see the Taliban at the gates of Kabul. I mean, the way we have seen cities drop over the past couple of weeks have sort of highlighted that the crisis is quite grave as far as the Kabul leadership is concerned. So now moving from that, when we're talking about South Asia and so on and so forth, look, from an Indian perspective, I mean, in my opinion, at least, we have missed multiple stations when it comes to Afghanistan and our Afghanistan policy. Something like, for example, as it was mentioned before, we've given them air firepower, which is in use now. We saw the Taliban actually drag India in, despite India not wanting to be dragged in, by releasing statements saying, oh, the Indian aircraft were used to bomb civilian hospitals or civilian areas and so on and so forth, basically implying to the Mi-35s that we gave in 2019, if I remember correctly. But we, of course, they were delivered, and if I remember correctly, it was a deal with Russia, and the airframes were brought through Belarus and so on and so forth. So they're not actually, Indian airframes that were shifted to Afghanistan. But we also did not provide enough spares and training and presence of capacity to Kabul when these birds were actually grounded for a long period of time. So because we did not, the whole concept of not having any presence on the ground also meant we did not want to deploy a team of technicians, let's say, on the ground, because that may also require for a security team to go with them. That could be IEF's Garud commandos or whoever it is. Even if you don't leave the military bases like Kabul, but you still have a presence there, it can cause, of course, murmurs to circulate in the Afghan society that the Indians have come here militarily and so on and so forth. But that's inconsequential. That is something we could have done to make sure that some sort of padding is provided to the processes that we are trying to save in Kabul, right? The democratic processes that we are trying to build, the institution we are trying to support in Kabul. So we have missed multiple stations, and we are at a position right now where if India talks to the Taliban also, I don't think it's going to, make or break anything. The Taliban have been saying for a long period of time that, we are open to talk to anyone, as mentioned before by my fellow panelists. And if you sit with them today, they will see you as equitable, right? They will see you as someone that is finding a requirement to talk to them, and not necessarily that they have to talk to us, right? So there is, it's not a level, it's a level playing field now. So whether you talk to them at this point of time or not is irrelevant. Whether we could have talked to them earlier, we could have tried to make inroads earlier, that's a long gone story now. I don't think there's any point sort of debating that. And look, as far as South Asia is concerned, the Afghans, if you talk to the Afghans in the government today, who are, for the lack of a better term, quite pissed sort of the the hands-off approach that they have seen from New Delhi, especially when we're talking about providing military support. And by this I don't mean boots on the ground, just equipment or spares or whatever it is. It's always been a no-no from an Indian point of view. So if it's going to be that risk averse, I think the whole point of debating whether it means X or Y for South Asia and so on and so forth really doesn't come into play. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Kabir. So basically, one point that came out most starkly to me was that India has delayed it too long, and now Taliban is in a stronger position. So I want to circle back to Dr. Raghavan. So in just purely diplomatic terms, is India underestimating the leverage it has? Both Russia and Iran, two key players, are good friends of India. Afghan government is keen for India to play a greater role. And even as mentioned by several people on the panel, the Taliban is also welcomes New Delhi's cooperation in Afghanistan. Further, India happens to be a member of the United Nations Security Council at the moment. Are we underestimating the leverage we have in sort of bringing together a coalition against Taliban and to serve our own strategic interests?
Well, many points have been made, and I'll answer your question, but let me briefly touch on some of them. The first point was what you had referred to earlier about Indian investments. The term investments conveys the wrong impression. These are not commercial investments whose return you have to protect. This was a gift or an aid to the people of Afghanistan. And most of it, or a lot of it, was in soft infrastructure, which was in terms of students coming here to do their MAs or BAs or studying engineering, medicine, and so on. And there's some amount of hard infrastructure too, but it's not a commercial investment. You're not protecting your fixed deposit in the bank, which means that you have to do something. It's something which you have given to another country, and really it is for that country to use as it will. So I think that aspect has to be kept in mind. The second point is, I think we have to be very realistic when we talk about military assistance, about our own capacities. In theory, there is no end to what you can do, but you also have to be realistic in terms of what is the bandwidth you have. And I think if one keeps our own capacities, if we take our own capacities into account, what you can do in material terms has always been constrained by that. There are also, of course, constraints of geography, which I had mentioned right in the beginning, that doing anything in Afghanistan is a major logistical exercise because you have to overfly either Pakistan or go across the Gulf via Iran. So it's not easy. I think you have to, whatever policy you decide on, and this applies to foreign policy in general, you have to take into account where we are coming from. Look at India around you, look at the capacities you have to spare, and how much can you invest in an external initiative or an external venture. I think that dose of realism is very important. The third point, is this whole question of the debate around whether we should engage with the Taliban and whether we have left it too late or whether we still have an opportunity to do so. I think this debate is, of course, very intense and many people take part in it, but it overlooks the fact that there's a major political shift underway. That a particular architecture or a particular order which had been put in place for the past 20 years, that order is changing. Regardless of what happens in terms of whether the Taliban secures outright victory or whether there's a political settlement, even at this stage, the fact is that architecture of the past 20 years is changing and is going to change very radically. And you have been a major beneficiary of that architecture. And the forces which are driving the change have not wanted you to have the kind of footprint you have in Afghanistan. To a great extent, the Pakistani drive to use the Taliban as an instrument to bring about political change in Afghanistan has also been driven by what they see as this Indian presence. Now, this shift on the ground, there's no act of diplomacy or reaching out or engagement which can reverse that. And if one looks at Afghanistan's history, you find things go through a cycle. There are upswings and downswings. If you've ridden on an upswing for some time, you also have to be prepared to ride the downswing. You can't use diplomacy as an instrument to try to be on the winning side all the time. Now, the question which you had asked about does India underrate itself? Well, you know, a lot depends on what is your view of India, because there is this view of India as being an entity which is on the cusp of greatness. There is another view of India which sees us having to deal with massive issues domestically and have therefore only limited capacities to spare for external engagement. And if you look at those limited capacities, I think we have done quite well. It's a different matter that in your neighborhood or in the wider region, things will not always go the way you want. This sense that you have to be winning all the time is something which requires a certain amount of correction and has to be, faced up with reality. So there is, if you look at the situation of Afghanistan, different countries have different interests. So far, the Iranian and the Russian position, and to a great extent the Chinese position, has been driven by this great sense of Schadenfreude, that the blow to American prestige and to Western prestige which they are suffering is something which is to their immediate advantage. Now, there is no act of diplomacy or policy on your part which can reverse that sense of gain which these countries feel. In time, they may change their position, and a lot will depend on what is the new architecture which emerges in Afghanistan and how much the Taliban has changed. Incidentally, I think it's too early to say whether the Taliban has changed or not, because I heard what Professor Swaran Singh has said, and I don't entirely disagree with it. But a lesson of history is that a force which has been fighting on the ground for 20 years tends to get more radicalized and not less radicalized. So what the Taliban leadership says in Doha, I don't think is necessarily reflective of the realities of the Taliban as they exist today.
Thank you, Dr. Raghavan. So the fact that there has been a major political shift, which has not spelled well for India. So one of the major strategic decisions India has taken was to align with the US and partner with the US in rebuilding Afghanistan along constitutional and democratic lines. So I want to bring in Abhijit on this. The US withdrawal has risked all of what India had been working on over the most part of the last 2 decades, and has also obviously threatened the regional stability, which probably endangers India more than any of the other neighbors. So what does this say about how far India can rely on the US as a strategic partner and when it comes to making its policies?
I think it was Winston Churchill who summed it up best, when he said that the Americans can be relied to do the right thing after they've exhausted all other options. The issue is the primary option here, which was actually targeting Pakistan, was never actually exercised. So they did not exhaust all options. So unfortunately, America really, if you look at, there's been a consistent failure of American think tanks across policy over and over and over again. You look at the way, for example, Trump was able to sign 4 or 5 different peace accords between Israel and Arab countries, when every think tanker in DC was telling you that was impossible. So there is a sort of a self-referential echo chamber that's there in DC, which becomes extremely dangerous when it comes to policy. They actually believe in certain things these days. And, policies, when they're based on beliefs as opposed to research and facts, becomes very problematic. India did, in a sense, you tell me, how are we going to get into Afghanistan without, cooperating with the Americans in some way or the other? This is the main reason the Chinese never got into Afghanistan and the Russians never really got into Afghanistan after the Taliban were kicked out in that sense. And India did want to play a role. It did cost us a lot with Russia as well. Remember Zamir Kabulov, people in Russia, my contacts within the Kremlin tell me he's compromised to Pakistan. The Afghans tell you Zamir Kabulov was compromised to Pakistan. Zamir Kabulov has made some statements which would sound almost indistinguishable from a Pakistani general talking. He was the one that made that very famous statement saying that, the solution to Afghanistan lies in Kashmir. So, there has been friction, but ultimately, we tried to sort of balance it off saying, let's set up an airbase at Al-Ain and Farrokhor in Tajikistan, where, we get the Russians also involved. We build strategic trust. That way the Russians know what we're doing. So we'll show if there's dependency on the Americans, there's also dependency on you. And a lot of it also had to do with the fact that the Iranians weren't allowing us to play whatever we wanted to do in Afghanistan as we wanted to do it. I've been to the end of the road from Chabahar to the Afghan border, and I've almost been to the end of the road on the Afghan side of the border. The issue is, at the end of that road, there is no connection between the two. Why? Because the Iranians wouldn't let you build it. That was number one. I just wanted to, add on to two things that Ambassador Raghavan and General Singhs said. We need to remember, Ambassador Raghavan was spot on, for the kind of limited resources we have. What we've achieved in Afghanistan is truly remarkable. Out of the last 70 odd years of independence, you've had an Afghanistan that's been hostile to us only for about 2-3 years in between when the Taliban were in control. Even the Mujahideen, what a coup that was, that when you had a Mujahideen government after Najibullah in Afghanistan, well, kind of a government, within the space of a few years, they turned on Pakistan and saw India as their best and great hope. Abdullah has a house somewhere in Lutyens, Delhi, for example. You run into him at the Claridge's every now and then, sipping tea in the lobby. So it's quite unfair to say that India hasn't pulled its weight. We've done what we can proportionate to our power, realistically speaking. And finally, I just wanted to address something that General Singh said, which was how there is no tribalism in Afghanistan when he interacts with them. That is true in urban areas. I have Tajik friends who will refuse to say they are Tajik. I have Uzbek friends in Mazar-e Sharif who will refuse to say they are Uzbek. They will just say Afghan. That's it. And that is, something unique about Afghanistan. They have a sense of a national identity. They have a sense of culture. They know who they are. The issue is they don't have a functioning country, right? But you go to rural areas. If you go into the deep interior where, in 2019, I was there in April, May 2019, going around Ghor Ghazni, all those places. There was no sense of, it was extremely tribal. Your particular tribe was the main identity. That is where your loyalty was and things like that. But even those structures were changing in a sense. So it's quite complex when you look at it. I think the only easy thing that we can say out here is, realistically speaking, is that something has to be done now, and it's a very clear-cut path on what to do. Again, to repeat what General Singh, to add to what General Singh and Kabir said, some of the I don't know if it is incompetence or deliberate planning or malfeasance on America's part, that the Tucanos, these Argentine propeller planes that, or is it Brazilian propeller planes that they use for close air support, the contracts were all given out to, the maintenance was given to contractors, and the Americans didn't pay them. And so the Afghan Air Force doesn't actually have, it doesn't know how to maintain them, and there's nobody looking after them and servicing them, right? So there's lots of little things that can be done. I don't think hope is entirely lost right now. There was also a lot of wishful thinking that went into it. Again, this, think tank culture. This was the same culture. Incidentally, I forget who it was that said, when we invade Iraq, people will come out on the streets and welcome us with roses. They thought that a country that is overwhelmingly almost a sedentary pastoralist society, that has always depended on raiding for acquiring surpluses would suddenly turn into this kumbaya democracy with everybody holding hands, women rights, LGBTQ rights, sing kumbaya in Mazari Sharif, and be happy and all of that. That was never going to happen. So this whole idea of even taking democracy out there, it sort of muddied the waters right from the beginning. You'd have probably been better off had somebody like Abdullah or Abdi Rashid Dostum or Amrullah Saleh doing what they normally do. They're very brutal people. But, we have to remember anthropological realities are different in different parts of the world. Isomorphic mimicry is the worst possible thing. It's one of those ab initio crimes in anthropology and sociology.
Thanks, Abhijit. So focusing on the way forward, right? You said something needs to be done and we should be talking about the way forward. I want to bring in General KJ Singh on this one. So you have mentioned in your recent article in Chanakya Forum that Taliban are willing to give assurances to India with regards to peace in Kashmir, regional security, women empowerment, and other inclusive solutions. And even Kabir just mentioned that earlier in the debate. How trustworthy are these assurances? Can India trust assurances from this militant terrorist group or groups?
Firstly, see, what is Taliban? We are looking at Taliban as a homogeneous kind of entity. No, they have different factions. They are aligned with different shuras. There is Quetta Shura, there is Kandahar Shura, there is Jalalabad Shura. There is another very distinct Taliban, which is Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, which has got some kind of angst against Pakistan. And Pakistan says, the ISI says that TTP is funded by India and India is supporting TTP. So in this labyrinth of Talibans, there is a very complex kind of a mixture or a kind of a collection of groups. Are they all going to listen? I am not too sure. Mullah Biradar is putting up a facade. He is very liberal with his assurances, but can they be enforced on the ground? And like what Ambassador Raghavan, Abhijit, Professor Swaran Singh, and even Kabir has touched upon, the society has a threshold level of violence. And having been at conflict, that has got further strengthened. So will all groups be controlled centrally? I don't think so. So there are difficulties, but let me flag 2-3 security related issues very quickly. One is what like Ambassador Raghavan said, India should remain focused on maintaining contact. We don't have to own it up. Discreet. We have to build up a kind of
Things seem to be breaking up. General Singh? Okay, I'm going to message General Singh and we'll get him back. Kabir, do you want to come in on this point and I'll message General Singh?
Yeah, okay.
No. I'll message him. Please go ahead,
right,
Kabir.
okay.
Who have such.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sir, your
Kabir,
voice is
you can go ahead.
Okay. So see, very quickly, we can. I mean, it's no sort of what do you say, like a hidden fact that there is factionalism within the Taliban. There are like various the interests. There are Uzbeks, there are Tajiks, there are Pashtuns. It's like that's not the point right now. The point is that they all do have a commonality of getting rid of the Americans and getting rid of Ghani. Right. So for the next couple of months, this factionalism is going to play out, but the larger sort of idea of what they want to achieve as quote unquote the Taliban is going to drive decision making. Right. So for example, of course, we have been seeing we saw what happened in Lashkar Gah, we saw what happened in Kandahar. Yesterday, they were saying that Mazar-e-Sharif has been surrounded by 4 areas, which is leading to India sort of to vacate the city and so on and so forth. Now, once these cities start to fall and so on and so forth, then the internal churns of the Taliban will come out more and more, right? For example, when it comes to Kabul, is it going to be the Taliban that took over the north, or it's going to be the Taliban that took over the south? That is actually the sort of going to be the premier in decision making, right? So all these things are going to come into play at a certain point of time, but for the moment, the idea of making the Americans leave and declaring the Ghani government as an illegitimate government, not capable of governing over the Afghan population, is going to keep a level of homogeneity together as far as the Taliban is concerned. Once that happens, once there is some sort of decision on what happens in Kabul in the coming months, once the last Western soldiers and Western interests leave Afghanistan, then we may start seeing some sort of factionalism and cracks come into play. And I'll just also add one more point that was being discussed earlier on China, right? So there have been these number of articles that China may and will decide sort of what happens next in Afghanistan and so on and so forth. I think that is coming, of course, from the fact that China has the capacity to actually make that happen. But you have to also remember that right now, for example, what China is doing is basically just throwing money. It's just throwing money to various warlords, to whoever will take it, to make sure that the ETIM and the TTP and so on and so forth, but basically their interest in Xinjiang and Badakhshan and so on and so forth is kept out of the larger narrative of what the Taliban is. Now, this is a quick fix, right? It's not a policy. It's not something that is ingrained Chinese thinking into how to control or manage Afghanistan. They have the money right now. The warlords always need money. They're throwing the money. That's what's happening at the moment. And finally, last point on the China thing is the Chinese do not have very good experience in dealing with Islam or the mullahs on the ground. They have absolutely no idea. Go talk to the Iranians; they will tell you of how badly. I mean, the Iranians are cunning in doing diplomacy. But they will tell you how badly it has gone with China over the past couple of years. So, and you don't even need to see Iran. You see Balochistan and how China has started to build these enclaves where only they live, and the others sort of live outside. They don't want to deal with Islam, or they don't want to deal with the local mullahs. They don't want to deal with the local sort of ethnography, so to speak. So this whole sort of China is going to come in and fix everything is a little bloated argument that we often see right now. It needs some significant course correction, in my opinion.
On that very point, right? What I gather is that we can't really trust on Taliban assurances right now because they're not some sort of united political entity. These different there are different militant factions that are only united to the extent of getting rid of the Western-backed government. After that, we don't know what their policies are going to be. So right now, their assurances don't really mean much. If that's true for India, it also applies to the kind of assurances China and Russia and Iran have received from them. So it's not necessarily that their strategy of engagement is actually better than India's principal stand, where we have stood with the Afghan government, because that's at least shows India's consistency on policy, that we helped create this government for democracy. Even if it ultimately loses, at least till the end, we stand our ground, and we are not like somebody who can, an opportunistic power with change stance. Because
look,
it might also be wrong.
Very quickly, look, you can be America, China, US, or whatever it is. If you're expecting a black and white answer from the Taliban, that's your problem. I mean, that's your indiscrepancy on realizing what the Taliban is, right? You have to remember, right now, the Taliban is actually not in power in Kabul. So they are going to take whatever support, whatever yes, no, whatever kind of capacity that is thrown at them, they will take it, which is what Doha process is all about. They like this entire sort of charade of meeting with various ambassadors, prime ministers, presidents, and so on and so forth, because it legitimizes them. As someone said today in the panel, it offers some sort of legitimacy to the movement. But coming back to my point, what I said earlier, does that legitimacy, does that view even translate to the Taliban on the ground in Afghanistan? I'm not talking about the Rabari Shura, I'm not talking about any Shura. Does it translate to the commanders on the ground? That is yet to be seen, and it has to be played out. Till then, of course, we can come up with theories and of what's going to happen, but it's really difficult to say right now.
Okay, And let me get Professor Swaran Singh on this one. Continuing on this point, if India were to engage with Taliban, even if, let's say, we are doing it unofficially, a lot of people here favor unofficially engaging with Taliban, but wouldn't that be seen as a sign of weakness? And wouldn't it embolden the terrorist groups aimed at India? Wouldn't, for example, Lashkar-e-Taiba think that, okay, if you stick your ground, eventually India will come around and negotiate with you? It worked for Taliban, it's going to work for us.
I think one quick example would be how India dealt with the military junta in Myanmar, for example. There could not be a stronger leaning for pro-democracy movement that India had for a long period of time that we had with the Myanmar democracy movement. We have never had that kind of commitment to democracy movement in Afghanistan. So to me, it's not if and whether India will. It's not a matter of choice for India. If Taliban comes to power, that's what India gets to deal with. That's not something we can be choosy about. Second point is that we are also saying Taliban is sort of faction-ridden, different outfits, and then they start sort of distributing the loot, shall we say. After coming to power, that factions could see far more bloodbath. But tell me one country where the political parties or parties in power are, sort of so ideally organized. I don't want to name names. Every political party has factions. Look at China, which we think is a monolith communist party, has factions. So, of course, Taliban will have factions, will have feuds inside. There could be bloodbath among various factional leaders. But there is some common denominator that we have noticed. For instance, the way they are behaving as if they have learned what happened to them last time and they are changing their overall broad sort of approximate stance. Look at how they are limiting their attacks to only Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. They are not aiming and targeting foreigners or minorities or others. Look at how one after another delegations are going and saying the same thing, reassuring neighbors, reassuring everybody, we are going to be nice guys this time. And they showcase. So there is some broader, method in madness, shall we say, which gives us some sense of how Taliban is going to come up and deal with the reality on the ground. Same applies to China, being the most influential country. Russia has burnt its fingers, has said they don't want to, engage directly, take any measures. United States and its European allies will not come back and do anything. So which is the country left? Pakistan, India, China, Tajikistan. Of course, that puts China on enormous advantage with deep pockets. As Kabir said, they could be willing to incentivize Taliban in various ways, but their interest in engaging Taliban is not limited simply to Xinjiang. They have enormous interest in assuring that China-Pakistan economic corridor expands and works on the ground. And they had, gradually gotten a lot of Central Asian republics. Even Russia was interested in joining CPAC. Iran is interested in joining in CPAC. They would like to make sure Taliban doesn't become a kind of a problem for them. And given the fact of intertwining of, various shauras were mentioned, there's also something called Rawalpindi Shaura, which is ISI, which is controlling recruitment, weaponization, political support, training, medical facilities, everything. Think of whatever. Only last week you had Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense calling up General Bajwa to say, you should control your safe havens. Thousands of terrorists, as Ghani government says, are entering from Pakistan to Afghanistan. So even if China has enormous deep pockets, it will not be able to work, and it will not like to work without taking its time-tested ally, Pakistan, along. Now, if China, Pakistan, Afghanistan come together to sort of reshape how Taliban takes on engaging the regional powers, and that will be enormous challenge for India. So therefore, you go back to example of mid-1990s when Ambassador Shulin in Islam was the first woman to engage Taliban, and that is where China had been in contact with and was engaging Taliban when they were in power in Afghanistan to make sure there's not much damage done to them in Xinjiang. All I'm saying is that could be one good model for India to follow, other than immediate interest of rescuing its people, making sure there's no violence against people of Indian origin or Indian citizens, Indian diplomatic corps, And that would require the power that is now ruling Afghanistan, which is Taliban forces. So unless we have a direct engagement, and the question of are we late or not, there is never late. You have already decided that now this is a changed trend. United States is no longer the player there. It's increasingly Taliban which is coming to power, and India has to engage. Sooner we do is better. Sooner we do it easier. At this stage, as they are still to take over Kabul, Taliban is willing to still engage all stakeholders, including India. India is not a small country, the neighborhood in that sense. India has a voice in United Nations Security Council right now. As I mentioned, India is chair of the Committee on Sanctions on Taliban. And if India can reciprocate even by, say, keeping silent about it, there are ways you reciprocate to Taliban. And in that sense, a direct connect with Taliban is already being tried. I'm sure that is happening, but strengthening that as soon as we can before Taliban takes over power in Kabul, because then they relatively, every next day, Taliban is becoming more leveraged compared to India in that sense. So India can, of course, go along with neighboring countries which are friendly to India. Iran and Russia could be one example. But a direct conversation, I think, is something which would be required. Diplomacy, I also want to underline, it's never clear victories and defeats. So even in the best optimal moment of your success in Afghanistan, you can pinpoint 30 years later, academics will be showing you what and all was going wrong at the same time. So it's not a matter of finding a clear victory and a clear defeat in any given situation. You have to maximize your leverages, maximize your gains, and minimize your losses. And given the situation, it looks like India doesn't have any option but to try and get directly engaged with Taliban as soon as possible to, at the base minimum, ensure safety and security of Indian citizens and people of Indian origin. And then, of course, also make sure that Taliban doesn't kind of drift away far too much in, singing the tune of ISI, which could not be, to the liking of New Delhi in that sense. So how to engage Taliban at this stage to make sure it doesn't become a counter to India in that sense. And last point, even in best of the circumstances between India and Taliban ruled Afghanistan, Taliban coming to power will be an inspiring example for other outfits. So even if in the best scenario, Taliban doesn't control entire Afghanistan, we will still see that in 1990s at the optimal level, they were controlling 3/4 of Afghanistan. They were still known as ruling Afghanistan. So they will have their limitations all the time. Likewise, India will have limitations of engaging the party that is in power in Kabul. But how much we can maximize gains and how much we can minimize our losses is where I think some kind of rethinking is already happening. And I think that is what I'm saying would require a direct connect, direct communication, direct dialogue with Taliban, which is happening to some extent. But more overt it becomes, the more Taliban will feel India reciprocating and recognizing them publicly. And in that sense, shifting from Ghani government to Taliban is something that we have to do on fast footing rather than taking it slow.
So I would like to examine the counter view to your argument. And on this one, we have General Singh back with us, so I want to get his view on this. So Professor Soren Singh is saying that we got to engage with Taliban. But for a long time, India has maintained a stance that we don't engage with Pakistan until cross-border infiltration and terrorism is completely ceased. Now, we know the close association between Pakistan and Taliban, which has become even more solidified, presumably because of the Chinese money now solidifying it. There is no way for India to match the Chinese money power in terms of changing the allegiance from China, Pakistan towards India or something else. So is there even any point in engaging with somebody who's so joint at hip with Pakistan if we don't want to engage with Pakistan directly?
See, since I wear uniform, and today it's become quite fashionable to start talking of, nationalism, how's the Josh and that kind of variety. Unfortunately, or you haven't picked on the right guy. I am the one who's always been saying the Josh has to be combined with how's the horse. So I have never believed in this concept that books will not go together. After all, we've had in February an agreement on LOC. It take place. It didn't fall from heaven or skies as a gift from top. Negotiated. our NSA was talking to their NSA, and it was being orchestrated by United Arab Emirates. So we have been maintaining back channel. So let's not take extreme positions. I would rather go along with Ambassador and Professor Swaran Singh. And I'm sorry if instead of being argumentative, we're also becoming, consensus building Indians. So I would recommend we should not bring too much, or if Taliban is showing some inclination to change, we should build that constituency. See, after all, it's a very strange thing that when India became independent, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan was the most loved person in India, and Frontier Gandhi was absolutely this thing, a very loved personality here. And Awami National Party, ANP, their delegates used to come to annual convention of All India Congress Committee. And Khan Abdul Wali Khan, Sendra Khan, all these people came and attended. Why did we lose that plot? In Indian psyche, Pashtuns, Kabliwala, and all this are very sort of, and Dilip Kumar was a Pathan who came from Peshawar. So Raj Kapoor came from there. So we must build those linkages. For that was a different compulsion where we were with Tajiks and Uzbeks, with Ahmad Shah Massoud and Rashid Dostum. Today the realities have changed. It will be a good idea to keep our contacts with Taliban. We have to do it discreetly. We have to encourage every move that they make towards moderate this thing. But let me touch on a very, very macro subject, which maybe Ambassador Raghavan and all have to look at it. Taliban is not only a group, it's an idea. This idea of extremism has to be also tackled, which America unfortunately has not done in a holistic manner. Even if you remove Taliban, there will be some other thing which will come up. There were Mujahideen, there is Taliban, some other, and the basic problem is that when Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates have decided to become moderates in political Islam, now they find shelter through Qatar. Qatar and Turkey are the new proponents of this political Islam. And what has Qatar done? Qatar has legitimized Taliban fast forward and still engaged in that process. So these countries have to be brought into some kind of a, because the world has to live peacefully. Even China should think of telling these countries that there is only a level of political Islam that world can live with. You can't allow it to spin out of control. Okay, you want to follow your religion, well and good. You want to be faithful to your religion, okay, that's acceptable. But there is a minimum threshold level for women's rights, for children education, for human rights, which has to be ensured. And the countries like Qatar and Turkey should take note of it. I know this has to be brought in through pressure. And my final remarks in this issue would be that India must remain engaged also in security dialogue, because today exercises are taking place right next to Afghan border, which are being done by Russia, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. If through the medium of CTSO, if India can find a place, we must definitely. If we can, like what Professor Swaran Singh was saying or Abhijit was saying, if we can have a base at Ayani or some other place, or Uzbeks are willing to give us, we must invest in these opportunities and work along with multiple players, work with Iranians, work with Americans, work with Russians, and also work with Taliban.
Very quickly on that point, there was last month an Economic Times and Washington Post reported that there are plans to resurrect the Northern Alliance. Can you tell us a little bit about the Northern Alliance, and do you think this would materialize?
See, Northern Alliance lost a lot of steam when Ahmad Shah Massoud passed away. He was a very iconic kind of figure. So if you look at the demography of Afghanistan, 45% or so are Pashtuns. And then there are Hazaras. Hazara is a very important tribe which needs to be invested in. Actually, my NDA coursemate, Khudaidar is a Hazara and he was a minister of narcotics. Another angle which you have to look at, Mayank, is what will happen to narcotics? What will happen to this economy? Because this has got huge big danger to India. Lots of it finds its way to India and to European and other countries. And Taliban, how will they control it? So coming back to your point, our natural allies are Hazaras, which are Shias, people who live in Herat province, which are Ismailis, which are our natural allies, Uzbeks and Tajiks. Tajiks are about 25%. They are the most dominant in that alliance. But I don't think that alliance is taking shape currently. I don't know why it is not taking place, but it's not taking shape. The Vice President Saleh is a part of that kind of this thing. Abdullah has also got certain hereditary linkages. He's of a mixed marriage. He's got Tajik blood also. But that alliance is not taking shape. Should India engineer it? I don't think it will be a correct thing to do. We should remain focused on this, that whoever legitimately gains power will support that government. And we should remain committed to that. At that, because to cobble up another alliance is a huge, big challenge. And last time the legitimacy was also because ISI had overtly brought up Mujahideens and later Taliban. Currently, they are not doing it overtly. Last time, if you remember, there was an airlift carried out at Kunduz, and there were Pakistan Army brigadiers and others which were evacuated from there. It was a face-saving kind of thing arranged for them. I don't.
Looks like we've lost him again. Okay.
No, I finished. I said that's what I feel.
We just lost you for 1 second, but that's fine. We got most of what you said. Thank you, General Singh. So we're running towards the closure of the session. We are running short of time. So now I'm going to ask the final question to circle back to the main topic of today's session. So invite all of you to share your concluding remarks when you answer this question. I want to quote General Singh, what he just said. Taliban is not only a group, it's an idea. And my question to all of you is, as the largest democracy in the world, are we willing to engage with this idea or what it represents? And in terms of, right now, let's assume a lot of things we talked about, right? Taliban, it seems like a foregone conclusion that Taliban is at some point likely to take over Kabul. It doesn't look likely Pakistan is going to be controlling it. So let's assume Taliban has the regional autonomy. But knowing their history, knowing what they're doing, there are already reports of them setting fire to schools, coming out with harsh restrictions on women, as well as what last year, we know this massacre of Sikhs at the Gurudwara, the killing, the assassination of the Indian journalist. Knowing all of that, is this a regime the largest democracy in the world should be engaging with? And let's start with Abhijit here, and then we go through all of you to conclude the debate. Abhijit, you got to unmute yourself.
Sorry, could you just repeat the question? Sorry.
Yeah, so basically, Taliban is not only a group, it's an idea. That's what General Singh just said. Is the largest democracy in the world willing to work with a regime that represents this gruesome idea?
Look, it's not a gruesome idea. It's Afghanistan. You have to understand that there is an urban-rural split out there, and rural Afghanistan. So this was something, I went on going to villages and asking people, going into people's houses, talking to them off the beaten path and things like that. And, even in areas that were Hazara, so Shia, essentially around Herat, they used to say, the Taliban aren't different from us. The only big complaint that, say, the Hazaras had were that they kill us for being Shia. And apparently that's also stopped now. right? So they're being quite careful not to kill Shias or massacre Shias and things like that at the moment. So, you know, when you go talk to them, you talk to average Tajiks and Uzbeks and things like that, they're like, well, you know, the Taliban aren't very different from us. They're essentially us. They believe in the same things we do. What's wrong with that? So it's not only, it's not gruesome, it is their reality. It is how, remember, 90% of Afghanistan was rural. Now, because of all the fighting, there's been a major influx of people into the cities. Kabul, if you look at pictures of Kabul from, say, 20 years back, the hills around Babur's tomb were almost empty. Today, that entire hill is a slum. It's a favela, and it's a really scary favela because you never know. You could kind of walk out of your bedroom into trying to get into your bathroom at night and fall off the cliff. It's that bad. So, you know, you've seen a lot of rural to urban migration, but those rural mores have stood on. Second, we should never fall into this Americanism, this huge American mistake of trying to impose our Weltanschauung on other communities and people that are not prepared for it. Let me give you the simple example of the UAE. I think it was Professor Swaran Singh who brought up UAE, I think, or Ambassador Raghavan or General Singh, I forget now. In the UAE, you have, say, Dubai and Abu Dhabi that have progressed to such a level of human development that they're willing to allow cohabitation without marriage. And on the other hand, you've had Sharjah, which has regressed into Sharia law, right? This sort of one thing suits all. We should never be doctrinaire or ideological about democracy. Because even if you have an Afghan democracy, who's going to be controlling it? It's going to be the local strongman who's essentially going to be ballot stuffing, getting his people to go vote for somebody and things like that. I think this insistence on democracy makes us a lot like the Americans in the 60s and 70s, and even now, this regime change. And this is, you know, we're not running an NGO to make people's lives better. There is a reason that foreign policy is foreign policy, and we leave activism and NGOism to certain kinds of clowns. So, you know, it's never good to mix the two, and to make this some kind of a credo and make this the hill that we die on, that it has to be reflective of Indian values, I think is a very, very dangerous path to go down. Let the Afghans find an equilibrium that suits their unique genius.
Foreign policy is about Indian interests, not Indian values. We'll move on to Dr. Raghavan. Concluding remarks, please.
Well, thank you very much. Very interesting discussion. On the specific question of Afghanistan, I think we should be guided by the realities and our interests. Now, if we are guided by realities and our interests, I think the most important thing to keep in mind is not to fall into this trap of fear of missing out. Other countries are following certain policies because of the specific interests they have. It doesn't mean we have to be doing the same kind of thing because our interests may be divergent. As I mentioned, there is a shift underway in Afghanistan, and we have to recognize with clarity what is that shift. And that shift is that this particular architecture, which was constructed and which gave you a lot of space to work with, that architecture is going to be changed. I don't think we should make ourselves breathless by trying to improvise solutions which will give us space in the new architecture. And which is why I say it's so important to take the downswing along with the upswings. The fact is that your policy on Afghanistan is guided by a larger factor, which is the India-Pakistan adversarial relationship. And there is no way you can frame a policy without taking into account that adversarial relationship. The downside of that is that there is a force which is now going to be increasingly influential in Afghanistan, and that force owes a great deal to Pakistan. I don't think we can devise policies, reach out, engage, ignoring that fundamental reality and that fundamental change. Now, this does mean doing something which there is often not a great deal of interest in, which is exercising strategic patience or keeping your powder dry, waiting to see what happens. These are not fashionable options. They're not even very easy options, but sometimes these are the best options because in the end, your strengths in Afghanistan are long-term. So rather than you're running after the Taliban, you should wait for things to crystallize, for the situation to mature, so that your strengths can come into play. And I don't think we should underestimate our strengths, but see that they work in a long-term sense.
Thank you. Strategic waiting can be the right policy sometimes. Kabir?
Yeah, all right. Very quickly, when we are talking about things like should we talk to the Taliban, or that gives an impression that we have never talked to the Taliban before. We have had contact with the Taliban for a long period of time. Of course, there have been lulls, and as Ambassador Raghavan also said, there are ups and downs which you have to go through. But we have had close contacts with the Taliban, which we are exercising now as well, right? Which we are using at this point of time to get some sort of semblance of what's happening on the ground in Afghanistan, what shape it is going to take in the time to come, and so on and so forth. And there are people we have had good relations with who were even close to Mullah Omar, and who have been telling India for a long period of time to maintain a good dialogue with the Taliban, whether they are in a strong position as they are in today, or whether in a weak position, but to maintain sort of that bridge. And that bridge has always been there. I think there have been a couple of years of up and down where we lose a good connection with the group in Afghanistan, but it's always been maintained at a very sort of base level. So we have to remember that when we are talking to the Taliban today, it does not mean that this is the first time India is doing some sort of path-breaking outreach to the group. We have done that before as well, and have maintained contacts over the period of time, which we are exercising now within the limitations and appropriate consultations that it is required to be done in both from a diplomatic perspective and from a security perspective. So just I'll end at that.
Thank you. Professor Swaran Singh.
Thank you. I think it's interesting debate. You said argumentative should be the focus, and be argumentative to close it. Compared to touching Taliban with a barge pole, to having a hug diplomacy, which is very fashionable last 6-7 years, we have to make choices of how much we wish to invest, because on that will depend what we get in return. You notice all neighboring nations are today welcoming Taliban delegations. I'm not saying India will do that or should do that, but just that Taliban would be happy to reciprocate and show that warmth and response, and depending on how we deal and how others deal with this desperate moment when Taliban is looking at public demonstration of engagement and support. One area where I think India can also opt in that sense in supporting, to make sure it does not become China, Pakistan, Afghanistan trio, which will go against India's interest a great deal. And because both Pakistan and China have had increasingly difficult relations with India in last 6-7 years again. So Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I think, is the one where from 2017, when it was revived, that contact group on Afghanistan was created in 2005, but it died, of course, in 2017. It is talking to both Ghani government and Taliban. And that is the only multilateral organization, either as members or as observers. Every stakeholder, every neighbor of Afghanistan is sitting there, where India would also have as a member certain say in decisions being made there. And that is where, other than direct engagement with Taliban, which I think is the need of the time, because every next day, I believe Taliban's desperation to engage India would be reducing, because they are going to be recognized increasingly by more and more countries, come to power in Kabul. So other than the urgency of fast forwarding, as I said, engagement with Taliban more overtly and publicly, Somebody has to calculate. I'm not the one who will calculate that, how fast forwarding that will become. But as Doha dialogue seems completely discredited, it seems Shanghai Cooperation Organization's contact group is where India can again see an opportunity to engage Taliban, where it could be possible for India to ensure some, going by the norms, by the rule, and some restraint on this trio coming together as Pakistan, Afghanistan, and China, and completely marginalizing India in that sense. In that sense, I think other than bilateral engagement, Shanghai Cooperation Organization is where India should look for an opportunity to really showcase how they can engage Taliban and gradually see that transition from Ghani government to Taliban.
So delaying engagement with Taliban while they keep getting stronger is likely to weaken India's leverage. Thank you. And finally, to conclude, we'll come back to General Singh.
I would tend to agree to this fact that we need not rush into, we should not show urgency to get involved in every kind of initiative that is being taken. We should weigh each initiative. We should step in carefully. We should maintain to build our soft power capital. So like what Ambassador Raghavan said, scholarships, education, those initiatives must remain, we must remain invested and must help. And whoever is in the power, we should even tell Taliban whenever we talk to them that we are willing to train their army also, whatever army they form, because we are willing to support whichever government which legitimately comes to power in Kabul. And India's core competencies lie in education, in health, in these kind of initiatives. So in that, we should remain invested. And there is no need to show this impatience or to feel being left out. There are times when you have to sit out, but our foreign minister seems to be doing a good job. He's been to all the relevant countries. He's put our things on the table, and let's wait and let's see what happens. And it's not going to be easy for whoever decides to put his major stake there. I will conclude by saying that China may want to incentivize through Pakistan, but Pakistan will also have serious problems after a while. It's not easy to deal with a group like Taliban. So there are interesting times. They are coming up. It may well be that person who's been left out may gain hell of a lot when issues start festering up between the new regime in Kabul and Pakistan, which is likely to happen because Durand line is a very artificial construct. So these are uncertain, interesting times, and we have to remain dynamic, but not get overtly sort of committed to anything. That's all I like to say. Thank you. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity.
Thank you. So India should spread its values through soft power, not hard power. Thank you. I think that's a very fine way to conclude what we just started with Abhijit, where he mentioned that diplomacy is about Indian interests, not Indian values. And I thank all of you for coming to Argumentative Indians and for sharing your views and insights. It was very informative. The whole session was very informative. Thank you to all of you. We hope to have you again with us in the future.